The admiral was tall, hard, and humorless. His face was of flint, and his will was of adamant. In the United States Navy, which he commanded, it was sometimes said, "He's so tough he shaves with a blowtorch." President Roosevelt was fond of repeating this quip in the admiral's presence, hoping to produce, if there had been no reports of fresh disaster in the past 24 hours, that fleeting cold spasm of mirth like an iceberg tick, which the President, the Prime Minister of England, and the Admiral's colleagues on the Anglo-American combined Chiefs of Staff were able to identify as a smile. If levity was rare in Admiral Ernest King, self-doubts or delusions were non-existent. He was aware that he was respected rather than beloved by the Navy, and he knew that he was hated by roughly half of the chiefs of the Anglo-American alliance. Mr. Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, hated him. So did Winston Churchill and Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke and Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham. Nevertheless, Admiral King continued to express the wish that was anathema in the ears of these men, as it was also irritating, or at least unwelcome in the ears of General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, and General H. Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Force. Admiral King wanted Japan checked. He wanted this, even though he was bound to adhere to the grand strategy, approved by Roosevelt and Churchill, concentrate on Hitler first while containing the Japanese. But what was containment? Containing the Japanese during the 3 months beginning with Pearl Harbor had been as easy as cornering a tornado. The Japanese had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet and all but driven Britain from the Indian Ocean by sinking Prince of Wales and Repulse, except for scattered American carrier strikes against the Gilberts and Marshalls. The vast Pacific from Formosa to Hawaii was in danger of becoming a Japanese lake. Wake had fallen, Guam as well. The Philippines were on their way. Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had already absorbed the Dutch East Indies with all their vast and precious deposits of oil and minerals. It had supplanted the French in Indochina and evicted the British. From Singapore, Burma, Malaya, and Thailand were also Japanese. The unbreachable Malay barrier had been broken almost as easily as the invincible Maginot Line had been turned. Japan now looked west toward India with her hundreds of millions, and if Rommel should beat the British in North Africa, a German-Japanese juncture in the Middle East would become a dreadful probability. Meanwhile, Great China was cut off, and Australia, to which General Douglas MacArthur had been ordered should he succeed in escaping from Corregidor, was threatened by a Japanese invasion of New Guinea. At that moment in early March, as Admiral King knew, the necessary invasion force was being gathered at Rabaul, the bastion which the Japanese were building on, the eastern tip of New Britain. All this ferocious speed and precision, all this lightning conquest, this sweeping of the seas and seizure of the skies, all this was containment? Admiral King did not think so. He thought it was rather creeping catastrophe. He thought that the Japanese, unchecked, would reach out again. They would try to cut off Australia, drive deeper eastward toward Hawaii, and build an island, barrier behind which they could drain off the resources of their huge new stolen empire. It was because King feared this eventuality that he had, as early as January 1942, when the drum roll of Japanese victories was beating loudest, moved to put a garrison of American troops on Fiji, already forging an island. Chained to Australia, he was still not satisfied. In mid-February, he wrote to General Marshall urging that it was essential to occupy additional islands as rapidly as possible. The Chief of Staff did not reply for some time. When he did, he asked what King's purpose might be. The Navy Commander-in-Chief, Comminch as he, was called, answered that he hoped to build a series of strong points from which a step-by-step advance might be made through the Solomon Islands against Rabaul. That was on March 2nd. 3 days later, Admiral King addressed a memorandum to President Roosevelt. He outlined his plan of operations against the Japanese. He summarized them in 3 phrases. Admiral Ernest King was not then aware of it, but he had at that moment put a tentative finger on an island named Guadalcanal. Japan was preparing to reach out again. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the faces of the planners were bright with victory fever. Who could blame them, really? Who else might bask?
So long in such a sun of success, without becoming slightly giddy. Of course.
Some of the officers of the Naval General Staff had passed from fever into delirium. Some of them, conscious that it was the Navy which had brought off the great stroke at Pearl Harbor, which had played the greater role in the other victories, which had shot the enemy aviators from the skies. Some of them were proposing that Australia be invaded. The Navy's cooler heads found the proposal ridiculous. The men of the Army General Staff thought it was impossible. The Army, they explained, could never scrape together the 10 divisions or more required for such an operation. The Navy officers nodded reflectively, saying nothing of their underlying suspicion that the Army, optimistic about Germany's chances against Russia that spring, was secretly hoarding its forces for use on the continent. The Army, as they knew, regarded the Soviet Union as the number 1 potential enemy. Therefore, the Army, looking northwestward, could not be expected to be enthusiastic about committing troops in the southeast. So the Naval General Staff decided that instead of invading Australia, it would be more feasible to isolate Australia. The flow of American war material to the island continent could be blocked by seizing eastern New Guinea and driving through the Solomons into the New Caledonia Fijis area. What did the Army think of this? The Army approved. It promised to furnish its South Seas detachment for the operation. These decisions also were reached in March, on the 8th day of that month. Lae and Salamaua in New Guinea were invaded. 2 days later, Finschhafen was occupied. Unknowingly, Imperial General Headquarters had pointed its baton at this island called Guadalcanal. Among the forces gathering for the operation to isolate Australia was the Japanese Navy's 25th Air Flotilla. Its mission was to hammer at Port Moresby, the big Allied base on New Guinea, which lay only a few hundred miles north of the Australian continent. But in early March, the 25th Air Flotilla was under strength. One of its 3 components, and perhaps the best in quality, the Tainan fighter wing, was still far away on the fabled island of Bali in the East Indies. Orders were dispatched to Bali, alerting the Tainan wing for movement. Saburo Sakai was the crack pilot of the crack Tainan fighter wing. Saburo was not only a born fighter, he was born into a fighting caste. He was a samurai, the scion of professional soldiers, and he could trace his ancestry to those samurai who had invaded Korea in the 16th century. Saburo regarded himself as a samurai, even though that caste had been abolished by the great Emperor Meiji at the end of the last century. Saburo was proud that his ancestors were among those haughty warriors of the city of Saga who had refused to give up their twin swords and had risen in revolt, and if, because of imperial rescript, the proud and cruel samurai could no longer be cruel, no longer swing their heavy two-handed sabers to sever at a single slash the body of some poor, defenseless Ita or pariah who had offended them, they could always remain proud. Saburo. Sakai's people had remained proud, scratching out a bare subsistence on a tiny farm near Saga, still scorning money, still wearing the emblem of the 2 sabers, symbolic of their caste, and still priding themselves on their stoic indifference to pain and the strength of their sword hands. Then, in the 1930s, The military adventurers seized power in Japan. The samurai was again in favor. His knightly code of Bushido, a mixture of chivalry and cruelty, was adopted as the standard for all the young men of Japan. In 1933, at the age of 16, Saburo enlisted in the Navy. He endured the purposeful torture called recruit training in the Japanese Navy, went to sea on. The battleships Kirishima and Haruna applied for the Navy Flyers School and was accepted. Saburo, a youth of normal Japanese height, which is about a half-foot shorter than that of the normal American, possessed an iron body. Though his nature was warm and good-humored, his will was of the same unbending metal. He became the outstanding student pilot of the year. He could hang by one arm from the top of a pole for half an hour, swim 50 meters in well under 30 seconds, stay underwater for 2.5 minutes, and because of fighter pilots, movements need to be quick. He had so conditioned his reflexes that he could catch a fly in a single lightning lunge. At the end of 1937, Saburo was graduated as the outstanding student of the 38th non-commissioned officers class. Of 75 hand-picked candidates for that class, only 25 had survived. One day, Japan would rue this policy of training only an elite, of providing itself with no reserve of skilled pilots to offset combat losses, but in the Sino-Japanese War of the mid-1930s, the Japanese pilots fought with such clear superiority as to indicate that they would have a long combat life indeed. Saburo Sakai fought in that war. He became famous for his ardor and daring. Wounded once during a surprise enemy air raid, he ran for his plane streaming blood, taking off to pursue the Chinese bombers and to cripple one of them, before he was forced to return to base. By December 7, 1941, Saburo Sakai was already an ace. He flew from Formosa in the first strikes against Clark Field in the Philippines. He was the first Japanese pilot to shoot down an American fighter over those islands. He was the first to flame a flying fortress, the very bomber piloted by Captain Colin Kelly, America's first war hero. By March of the war 1942, Saburo Sakai had shot down 13 aircraft, Chinese, Russian, British, Dutch, and American. By that time, also, he and his comrades had reassembled at Bali. They were there to rest, but inactivity only made them restless. They became irritable. They fought with the soldiers who guarded their base. They drank or visited those brothels without, which no Japanese military force can long endure. Saburo Sakai did neither, for he was a fighter pilot and a samurai, who stuck to his code. Nevertheless, he also fretted, wondering if he would ever get home to see his family. On March 12th came the great news. Rotation. The men with the longest time overseas were being relieved to go home, and Saburo had more time out than any of them. But the new leader of the wing, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, did not call Saburo's name. Crushed, Saburo asked him if there had been a mistake. "No, you do not go home with the other men," Nakajima said. "I need you, Sakai, to go with me. We are advancing to a new air base. It's Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, the foremost post against the enemy. You're the best. Pilot in the squadron, Sakai, and I want you to fly with me." There was no appeal, not for an enlisted man in the Japanese Navy. Heartbroken, Saburo Sakai became one of 80 pilots who were herded aboard. A tiny, stinking, decrepit freighter for the 2,500-mile voyage to Rabaul. Only a 1,000-ton subchaser escorted them, indifferent to human suffering, and therefore blind to human value. Japan had placed a good portion of her finest naval flyers aboard a rusty old derelict and exposed them to the very real peril of a single torpedo or 500-pound bomb. But the rattler made Rabal. It entered spacious, horseshoe-shaped Simpson harbor and discharged its passengers. The pilots were appalled. Guadalcanal. Airfield was little more than a narrow, dusty airstrip set in the shadow of a live volcano. From time to time, a deep rumbling shook the field, and smoke and stones spouted from the crater's mouth. Nevertheless, the men took heart when a seaplane tender delivered 20 of the latest models of the Zero fighter. They went back into action, and Saburo Sakai was again the scourge of the enemy. He flew on fighter sweeps to Port Moresby or escorted twin-engine Betty, bombers on raiding forays over the big Allied base, and he shot down enemy planes with astonishing ease. The American P-39s and P-40s, Bell Airacobras, and Curtiss Warhawks were no match for the Japanese Zeros. The Zero was faster and much more maneuverable, and no one could cut inside an enemy. Fighters turned so sharply as Saburo Sakai, bringing the American or Australian pilot under the full aimed fire of twin 20mm cannon and a pair of light machine guns. Saburo's squadron always flew west toward New Guinea, but there were other planes of the 25th Air Flotilla which flew southeast to the Solomon Islands, beginning with Big Bougainville about 200 miles southeast of Rabaul. The Solomons run on a southeast tangent for roughly another 400 miles. They form a double chain of islands, actually the peaks of a great drowned mountain range, facing each other at near regular intervals, across a straight blue channel from 20 to 100 miles wide. The objective of the Japanese bombers was the tiny island of Tulagi, the site of the headquarters of the British resident commissioner, for Britain held the Southern Solomons, and now used by the Royal Australian Air Force as a seaplane base. There was also a radio station on Tulagi. The Japanese bombed it regularly. They could not know that their explosives were merely convulsing the rubble of ancient and inadequate radio equipment. The operator, a retired Australian seaman named Sexton, had continually complained to headquarters. "If the Japs come here and ask me where the radio station is and I show them this, they'll shoot me for concealing the real one." Tulagi had an excellent anchorage, formed between the island's northern shore and the bigger bulk of Florida Island to the north, sometimes after the Japanese. Pilots had watched their bomb hits making yellow mushrooms on the radio station, or their misses forming white rings in the black of the bay. They banked lazily to fly low over a large, long island 20 miles directly across the channel, behind or to the south of Tulagi, Florida. Seen from the sky, it was a beautiful island, about 90 miles in length and 25 at its wide waist, and traversed end to end by lofty mountains, some as high as 8,000 feet. The mountains crowded steeply down to the sea on Guadalcanal's southern or weather coast, abruptly joining reefs and rocks where a thunderous tall surf pounded eternally. No boats could land on that coast, and very few could hold at anchor there. But the northern coast, there was a long and gentle shore upon which the smallest boats might beach. Here, groves of seaward-leaning coconut palms threw star-shaped shadows upon white beaches, scoured by murmuring wavelets. Here the islands numerous, swift, and narrow. Rivers came tumbling down to the sea or were penned by impassable sandbars into deep lagoons, and here the sun sparkled on water, glinted off the brilliant plumage of jeweled birds, glittered on sand and beamed upon mountainsides, dappled by broad patches of tall tan grass. At night, on one of those high, soft, star-dusted southern nights when a white wand of a moon enchanted all in violet and silver, it broke the pilots' hearts. It was a lovely island, as exotic as its Spanish name, a word which contained two of those outlandish L sounds which, on Japanese lips, usually come forth as R and so the flotilla's pilots referred to their enchanted island as Katakana. And that, of course, is Japanese for Guadalcanal. Martin Clemens was on Guadalcanal. He was the British district officer. He was as British as a young and charming and ambitious civil servant can be. In his late 20s, Martin was a dashing figure, tall, blond, and handsome in his slouch. Hat and khaki shorts, a small pistol at his hip, a fine military mustache upon his, lips and a radiant golden beard beginning to burgeon upon his chin. Martin Clemens had been 3 years in the Southern Solomons, having trained there as a cadet and served as a district officer on San Cristobal, southernmost of the chain, and Malaita on the opposite side of the channel. Clemens knew the loneliness of these sparsely inhabited islands. He had spent days in the wilderness of the jungles, seeing only his native scouts and carriers. Coming suddenly upon those tiny villages which were often only clusters of thatched huts set upon the cliff of some abyss or the bank of some wild river. There the district officer was respected because British law was feared, but there also no able-bodied male was ever without his tomahawk or spear. Clemens also thought that Guadalcanal was beautiful, on the outside. On the inside, he knew, she was a poisonous morass. Crocodiles hid in her, creeks or patrolled her turgid backwaters. Her jungles were alive with slithering, crawling, scuttling things, with giant lizards that barked like dogs, with huge red, furry spiders, with centipedes and leeches and scorpions, with rats and bats and fiddler crabs, and one big species of land crab, which moved through the bush, with all the stealth of a steamroller. Beautiful butterflies abounded on Guadalcanal, but there were also devouring myriads of sucking, biting, burrowing insects that found sustenance in human blood, armies of fiery white. Ants, swarms upon swarms of filthy black flies that fed upon open cuts and made festering ulcers of them and clouds of malaria-bearing mosquitoes. When it was hot, Guadalcanal was humid. When the rains came, she was sodden and chill, and all her reeking vegetation was soft and squishy to the touch. No, she was neither enchanting nor lovable, and Martin Clemens had not liked her since he came to Aola Bay on Guadalcanal's northeast coast at the end of January. Now, at the end of March, he was in charge of the entire island and faced with the problem of what to do with a native population whose loyalty seemed to be wavering. 3 months ago, there had been peace and order. But then, with the Japanese occupation of Rabaul, all had changed to chaos. Most of the Europeans had fled, and many of their habitations had been wrecked by natives either, resentful or parading resentment as an excuse for looting. Some of the older natives could remember that the Germans had been ousted from Bougainville in World War I. Some of them were wondering aloud if the detested Japanese, those short tan men who plundered the pearl shell on the natives' reefs, were actually tough enough to do the same to the British. Were men like Ishimoto to replace the district officers? Mr. Ishimoto, the surly little carpenter who had worked for the Lever Brothers plantation on Tulagi, would he be back with his conquering countrymen? What would happen to them all then? What would the Japanese do to them? Up north, they had heard, the Japanese had slaughtered cattle and requisitioned food. They had forced the natives to work for them. They had killed missionaries and closed the mission schools, opening their own where the only thing they taught was how to bow low, and the Japanese were coming. This they knew. Their minds were not so simple as to mistake the meaning of the bombing raids on Tulagi. So they came crowding around Clemens, these headmen, their dark bodies, glistening with sweat, their strong white teeth stained red with betel nut juice, their huge fuzzy heads bleached pink with lime and fire ash, their broad, seamed faces alive with anxiety and doubt. "Japan he come, massa," they said. "You stop along us?" Clemens nodded gravely. "No matter altogether, Japan he come," he said. "Me stop along you fellow." Their tense faces relaxed, and Clemens continued. "Business belong you fellow. All the same follow me. All the way. By, altogether man belong me fellow. Come save you me. Me no savvy who, me no savvy when, but by. Everything he all right." It was not a very spectacular promise, especially on the lips of a stranger most. Of them had never met before, but it was all that Clemens could say. "Stick with. Me and you won't be hurt." The headmen left with quiet murmurs. Clemens could only hope they would. Stick. Meanwhile, he thought with gentle irony, "My orders remain. Deny the resources of the district to the enemy." How? With whom? He was alone, but four. A few gold miners up on Gold Ridge. D.S. McFarlane, the Australian naval officer who had taught him how to use the teleradio, had already upsticked and away, taking with him Ken Hay, the manager of Barande Plantation. Clemens smiled at the thought of the two of them back in the bush, McFarlane in his immaculate whites, Hay, one of the fattest men he had ever seen, puffing up a jungle track. Then there was Snowy Rhodes. Snowy was at the northwest end of the island. Snowy, with his bushy hair and cold eyes and prizefighter's stance. He was tough enough. Too tough, in fact. He liked the idea of the Japanese coming so that he could kill a few of them. The difficulty with Snowy would be to keep him and his police boys quiet. If they were going to be of any use as coast watchers, they had to lie low. Martin Clemens looked at the teleradio McFarlane had brought him. This and his police scouts would be about all he had, not to deny the enemy, but to spy on the enemy once they came. For Martin Clemens, besides being a British district officer, was also a coast watcher for the Royal Australian Navy. Lieutenant Commander Eric Felt of the Royal Australian Navy directed the Coast Watchers, that unique organization of brave and resourceful men who operated inside Japanese-occupied territory to report on enemy movements. It was Commander Felt who had sent McFarlane south to instruct Clemens and the others in the use of the teleradio and to teach them code. They were not of much use at the moment, but they would be, for the enemy operation obviously. Preparing in Rabaul would most certainly engulf the southern Solomons, coast watchers of the northern Solomons, and on the tiny islands off-lying. Rabaul and her sister base of Kavieng on New Ireland were already operating. It was they who had reported the Japanese invasion buildup, and their signals, describing enemy aerial formations, had been invaluable in alerting bases such as Port Moresby to the danger of air raids. In choosing his coast watchers, Felt had generally selected islanders, mostly Australians, who scorned to wear any man's collar and had found the independence they prized in the untamed islands of Melanesia. They were planters, ship captains, gold miners, or unmitigated scamps, with here and there a blackbirder or slave trader. They drank very, very hard, loved widely and freely, looked down upon the natives with a protective paternalism, and spoke a language which, bristling with "bloody this" and "bastard that," was unprintable. In the extreme, especially when it relied upon a famous four-letter word which was used to modify everything except the sexual act that it described. Missionaries were always shocked to discover that the pidgin English they were expected to use was studded with these words. Ashes, for example, were described as "shit belong fire," and an enemy bombing raid reported as "Japan, he shit along sky." However their shortcomings, the islanders were intensely loyal. They could be relied upon to hate the Japanese with the fine and fruitful ferocity of the free. Man who has his back to the wall. Because of this, they were chosen by felt, and it was a wise choice. By the end of March, a coast-watching chain extending from New Ireland down to San Cristobal at the southern end of the Solomons was complete. The men in the perilous northern stations, absolutely dependent upon the fidelity of their native scouts, none of whom would ever betray them, skillfully eluded Japanese patrols while continuing to feed precious information into the Allied intelligence network functioning in Australia under the command of General MacArthur. A few days before General Douglas MacArthur made his dramatic escape by torpedo boat from Corregidor, the big carrier Enterprise dropped anchor in Pearl Harbor after a successful bombing raid on Japanese-held Marcus Island. On her bridge was a pugnacious admiral with a huge commanding head and a craggy, bristling face. He was William F. Bull Halsey, perhaps the most aggressive admiral in the American Navy. Bull Halsey had already led the strikes on Wake and the Marshalls, and was already famous at home for his hatred of the enemy and his salty contempt for faint-hearted sailors. The day Admiral Halsey had sailed into Pearl Harbor and seen the horrible wreckage of the fleet in battleship Row, he had snarled through clenched teeth. Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell. A few days later, at sea again, and infuriated by a bad case of jitters developing in his task force, he signaled his ships. Halsey and the Enterprise were not to remain long in Pearl for Admiral Chester. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Ocean area, had an assignment for him. The white-haired Nimitz explained it briskly to his most valued commander. In January of 1942, Admiral King had conceived the idea of staging a spectacular diversionary raid on Japan. King's proposal had received the enthusiastic support of General Arnold of the Army Air Force. Arnold had agreed to provide 16 long-range Mitchell medium bombers under command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. They were to be trained to take off from Navy carriers. That force was now ready. Nimitz asked Halsey, "Do you believe it would work, Bill?" "They'll need a lot of luck." "Are you willing to take them out there?" "Yes, I am." "Good," Nimitz said. "It's all yours." Bull Halsey left Nimitz's headquarters to confer with Doolittle. They agreed that they would try to sneak to within 400 miles of Japan, but that they would launch the planes from farther out if they were discovered. They agreed also, gleefully, that the attack would rattle the enemy's front teeth, even though it was far from making a real war of it with Japan. War with Japan, the United States Marine Corps had maintained for 3 decades, would be a naval war, an island war, an amphibious war. In 1921, one of the Marines' most thoughtful officers, Lieutenant Colonel Earl Pete Ellis, wrote a prescient essay which began with the words, "Japan is a world power, and her army and navy will doubtless be up to date as to training and material. Considering our consistent policy of non-aggression, she will probably initiate the war, which will indicate that, in her own mind, she believes that, considering her natural defensive position, she has sufficient military strength to defeat our fleet." From this, Ellis concluded, "In order to impose our will upon Japan, it will be necessary for us to project our fleet and land forces across the Pacific and wage war in Japanese waters. To effect, this requires that we have sufficient bases to support the fleet, both during its projection and afterwards." Bases meant islands, Ellis argued, and many of these would be defended. No matter, they would have to be seized, and Ellis went on to forecast, with remarkable accuracy, the kind and size of force that would be needed to do it. Unfortunately, Ellis lost his life while on an espionage mission in the Pacific, murdered, some investigators suggest, by the Japanese within their Caroline Islands bastion. But Ellis's conclusions were not forgotten by the officers who, were to command the Marine Corps in the years between the wars. Chief of all, these men refused to accept the dreary dictum which the British debacle at Gallipoli in World War I seemed to have laid down, that hostile and defended shores cannot be seized from the sea. The Marines argued that they could, moreover, that it was not necessary to capture ports with all their facilities, but that invasions could be made across open beaches. Most brass ears were deaf to this doctrine. Many generals and some admirals regarded Marines as nothing but beach jumpers, who were unfit to command more than a platoon, let alone evolve and develop new military doctrine. After all, the Marine Corps was a mere auxiliary force of scarcely 20,000 men. It was only, in the favorite phrase of its detractors, one which President Harry Truman was to make notoriously erroneous in the Korean War, the Navy's police force. But the Marines persevered. They had to. Without amphibious warfare, they had no reason to be regarded as anything else but naval police. Fighting for their existence, they developed amphibious tactics and equipment. The New Orleans boat builder, Andrew Higgins, was encouraged to continue experimenting, sometimes at his own expense, with better and better types of landing craft, and from the inventor, Donald Roebling, came the Alligator, a tracked boat able to crawl over land obstacles, which was to be the forerunner of the famous Amtrak. Practice landings were made whenever the Navy could be persuaded to make a few ships available, and anything that was done had to be done on a shoestring, for American Congresses between world wars were as bellicosely pacifist as the Cold War. Congresses have been meekly military. Budgets were gleefully meat-axed to the starry-eyed approval of a nation naively convinced that if you turn your back on war, it will go away. Foremost in this American between wars custom of making mock of uniforms that guard you while you sleep was the Senate Armed Forces Committee that sought to embarrass the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, by inquiring if the Army really needed all of that toilet paper it had ordered. In such surroundings, caught between two fires as it were, the Marines worked out their ideas on amphibious warfare. Meanwhile, the Marines, unlike other branches of the service, were consistently in action between the wars. They were fighting the banana wars, learning, in the jungles of Haiti and Nicaragua, all the lessons of jungle warfare that would be applied on a much larger and more vital scale in the wildernesses of Oceania. Service on the Navy's capital ships taught them to appreciate the importance of sea power, as well as of ship-based air power and duty at troublesome China stations enabled them to study the Japanese at first hand, and to learn, most valuable lesson of all, not to underestimate them. It was a hard school, but out of it came a stream of tough and seasoned professionals fired with a sense of mission. One of them was Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift. Tall, strong, hard-jawed, and extremely courteous, Archer Vandegrift was of old Virginia stock, the grandson of Confederate soldiers. He had spent his boyhood listening to their stories, and he could never forget the grandfather who had prayed to the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson. Archer Vandegrift was in the mold of Stonewall Jackson. He was both wary and audacious, seldom without a plan. He had been a Marine officer, for 33 years having spent some of his most instructive ones under General Smedley D. Butler, the celebrated and legendary Old Gimlet Eye of the Banana Wars. Butler had given him the passing nickname of Sonny Jim, because Vandegrift had ridden the cow-catcher of a rickety old Nicaraguan locomotive to look for mines, as Butler had ordered and had come back to report with a grin on his face. 2 decades later, On March 23, 1942, at New River, North Carolina, General. Vandegrift received both his second star and the command of the 1st Marine Division. He had already been its assistant commander, having helped plan and conduct practice landings, one of which was an oddly prophetical exercise at Solomon's Island on Chesapeake Bay. But now he had full charge, and he poured all his energies into raising it from about 11,000 men to its full strength of 19,000. Each of the 4 regiments, 1st, 5th, and 7th Rifle Regiments, the 11th of Artillery, was under strength. From all over the Marine Corps, the old salts and China hands came pouring into New River. There were NCOs yanked off soft planks at the Navy yards. There were grizzled old gunnery sergeants who had fought in France or chased cacos in Haiti or bandidos in Nicaragua. There were inveterate privates who had spent as much time in the brig as in barracks, gamblers, drinkers, and connivers, brawlers who had fought soldiers and sailors of every nationality in every bar from Brooklyn to Bangkok, blasphemous and profane with a fine fluency that would astound an Australian coast watcher. They were, nevertheless, professional soldiers who knew their hard calling in every detail, from stripping a machine gun blindfolded to tying a tourniquet with their teeth. They were tough, and they knew it, and they exulted in that knowledge. No one has described them better than Colonel John W. Thomason. They were the leathernecks, the old breed of American regular, regarding the service as home and war as occupation, and they transmitted their temper and character and viewpoint to the high-hearted volunteer mass. And those high-hearted volunteers, the new breed, were also streaming into New River to flesh out the division and to transmit to the old breed something of their own temper, their gaiety, and their zest. These were the youths fresh from boot training at Parris Island. They knew almost nothing about war, but they knew why they had gone to one. In their late teens and early 20s, they had stormed the recruiting centers after the news of Pearl Harbor had been broadcast. Some of them had come straight from basketball games and bowling matches, still clutching the little canvas bags containing their uniforms or bowling balls. They were angry. Their country had been attacked without warning. Standing in line to be examined by the doctors, they had muttered over and over, "The little yellow bastards, the little yellow bastards." They wanted to kill Japs, they told the officers who questioned them. These were not refined or oblique or delicate young men, these youths, who were filling the ranks of the 1st Marine Division that spring. No, they were mostly tough guys, some of whom could be fairly described as juvenile. Delinquents, whose primitive instincts had been aroused by the infamy of the enemy. Yet they were idealistic, too. They felt vaguely that they were being noble by volunteering to fight their country's battles on the very day of disaster. Unfortunately, they had no battle cry to express their inmost feelings. They were not able to shout, like the enemy they would meet, "Blood for the Emperor." Few of them had heard of the 4 freedoms, and those who had were not likely to proclaim them in combat, instinctively aware that conclusions, however, accurate and humane, can never rally men to battle. And so they had to substitute the next best, or perhaps even a better thing, their sardonic sense of humor. And this was well expressed by the youth who came to the Federal Building in New York on the night of December 7th, 1941, only to be told by the doctor that he could not be accepted by the Marines unless to conform to certain health standards he had himself circumcised. "Circumcised?" the startled youth burst out. "What in hell do you think I'm gonna do to the enemy?" Nevertheless, the doctor was adamant, and the youth departed to have the operation performed. A month later, he was in Parris Island, where he was given the nickname of Lucky, and in March of 1942 he had joined the flood of Marines flowing to New River. With such men, old breed and new, with his. Veteran battalion and regimental commanders, Archer Vandegrift hoped to forge. A fine amphibious striking force. They should be ready to go, he thought, at about the end of the year. Admiral Yamamoto had dropped a blockbuster, the commander-in-chief of Japan's. Combined Fleet had proposed the capture of Midway Island, only 1130 miles, from Hawaii, and he was demanding approval of this daring plan over naval. General Staff's own modest operation to isolate Australia. Staff was both appalled and disconcerted. Appalled because the dangers of this. Long thrust into American waters seemed so obvious, disconcerted because even. Though Staff was superior to Fleet and could veto the Midway Plan in those days. Of Japan's victory fever, it would be a bold admiral indeed who would challenge. Isoroku Yamamoto. His popularity and prestige were enormous. He was the idol of the fleet, this. Iron Admiral of the shaven head and square fighting face. He was revered as a combat sailor who had lost 2 fingers of his left hand serving under Admiral Togo at Port Arthur, and admired as a strategist and planner who was beginning to rival even that immortal of Japanese history. Moreover, Yamamoto's reputation for integrity was invincible. All of the generals and admirals of Imperial General Headquarters were aware that Yamamoto, almost alone among ranking officers, had warned Japan against going to war with America. In 1940, the fire-breathing young army officers of Tojo's war party so hated Yamamoto that he was deliberately relieved as Navy Vice Minister and sent to sea as Chief of Combined Fleet because, in the words of a member of the Supreme War Council, he would have been assassinated if he had stayed in Tokyo, and that would have been a great loss to our country. In that same year, Yamamoto was asked by former Premier Prince Konoye if Japan had a chance against the United States, and he replied, "I can raise havoc with them for 1 year, but after that I can give no guarantee." Yamamoto knew. America, the character of its people and its incredible industrial potential, for he had served as a naval attaché in Washington, where his renown as a cool and daring poker player was rivaled only by his obvious hatred for his hosts. Nevertheless, in a letter that the Americans were even then misquoting and misinterpreting, Yamamoto had written to a friend, "If we should go to war against the United States, we must recognize the fact that the armistice will have to be dictated from the White House." By this, he meant merely that Japan had no hope of victory, and not, as the American press was then proclaiming, that this arrogant little monkey man expected to coil his tail in the White House. Yet, once the decision for war was made, Isoroku Yamamoto served his emperor with single-minded devotion. More than any man he had been responsible for. The strategy of striking America suddenly and hard, of pushing her so far back in the Pacific and so crippling her power to retaliate that by the time she recovered, she would be faced with a long and costly war, one that she would be eager to terminate by negotiation. Thus, Yamamoto had pursued what was virtually his own policy when directing Combined Fleet from his flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato. He had delivered those first-phase sledgehammer blows. And now the time for the second phase was at hand, and Isoroku Yamamoto was reaching out again. On April 2nd, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, Operations Officer of Combined Fleet, came to Tokyo to present Yamamoto's plan. He met Commander Tatsukichi Mio, representing Navy General Staff, like most staff officers. Consulting the victory men of Fleet, Mio was carefully courteous. He did not decry, but plead. He was almost in tears as he tried to warn Watanabe of the dangers of the Midway operation. But Watanabe was obdurate, and the debate continued for 3 more days. On April 5th, as though weary of the wrangle, Watanabe arose from the conference table to place a direct call with Admiral Yamamoto aboard Yamato. He returned to state Yamamoto's uncompromising position. In the last analysis, the success or failure of our entire strategy in the Pacific will be determined by whether or not we succeed in destroying the United States fleet, more particularly its carrier task forces, the Naval General Staff advocates, severing the supply line between the United States and Australia. It would seek to do this by placing certain areas under Japanese control, but the most direct and effective way to achieve this objective is to destroy the enemy's carrier forces, without which the supply line could not in any case be maintained. We
believe that by launching the proposed operations against Midway, we can
succeed in drawing out the enemy's carrier strength and destroying it in decisive battle. If, on the other hand, the enemy should avoid our challenge, we shall still realize an important gain by advancing our defensive perimeter to Midway without obstruction. It was obvious that Isoroku Yamamoto was determined that his plan should carry. With great reluctance, Rear Admiral Shigeru Fukudome turned to Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito to ask in a low voice, "Shall we agree?" Ito nodded silently, and Watanabe left the conference room beaming. Nevertheless, Naval General Staff's approval was not wholehearted. Bickering over the date began. Fleet wanted Midway to take place in early June, Staff rather more like early July. And this may have been because the Naval General Staff's operation against Australia was already begun. The Japanese aerial onslaught against Port Moresby and Tulagi was mounting. To help press it, Saburo Sakai's squadron had been transferred on April 8th to the new base at Lae on New Guinea. Lae was closer to Port Moresby. It was also a pest hole. Its airfield was even smaller and bumpier than Guadalcanal at Rabaul, and the food was abominable. Each morning, the pilots arose at 3:30 to gulp down an unpalatable breakfast of rice, soybean paste soup, dried vegetables, and pickles. Then, at 8 o'clock, they flew either patrol or fighter missions, back for lunch of rice, and canned fish or meat, which was repeated for dinner. The pilots either went on standby duty or roared aloft to intercept sudden enemy attacks until, at 5 o'clock, they assembled for calisthenics. After supper, they read or wrote letters home or held impromptu concerts with accordions and harmonicas and guitars. It would have been a dull and deadly routine but for the constant thrill of an aerial combat. Day after day, for 4 months, Saburo Sakai gunned his mud. Brown Zero aloft from the strip at Lae, climbing high into the sky to go winging. Over the towering 15,000-foot Owen Stanley Mountains, standing between Lae and Port Moresby, and to fall upon the enemy with flaming guns, steadily his score of kills mounted, 20, 30, 40, 50. It seemed incredible. Saburo was easily Japan's greatest ace, and his fame went far and wide through the homeland and the South Seas. One day a rookie pilot named Hiroyoshi Nishizawa joined the squadron. Saburo was astonished to see with what skill Nishizawa shot down an enemy. Era Cobra on his first flight. Nishizawa was a natural, and Saburo wondered if he was not also better than he was. One thing Saburo did know, neither he nor his comrades were very fond of Nishizawa. Silent and surly, this skinny youth of 23 years kept to himself. He was rarely seen smiling, unless it was the bloodless grimace with which he reported a fresh kill. The devil, they called him. Another accomplished rookie pilot was Toshio Oda, who was even a year younger than the devil. Sakai, Nishizawa, and Ota, Japan's 3 top aces in that order, they were soon to become the scourge of New Guinea, kings of the air. Above the bright blue coral sea and the squadron in which they flew was by far the most outstanding in the war. Lieutenant J.G. Junichi Sasai commanded the squadron. The men loved him. Unlike most graduates of Itajima, the Japanese Annapolis, he had compassion for the enlisted men. He haggled with the quartermaster for the candy. They needed to replace energy sapped by ceaseless combat, or he procured cigarettes for them. They called Lieutenant Sasai the Flying Tiger, not in allusion to the American volunteer group of pilots whom Saburo had met in China, but because of the roaring tiger carved on the big silver belt buckle he wore. In Japanese legend, a tiger prowls 1,000 miles and always returns from his hunt. That was the meaning of the buckley. Sasai's father, a retired Navy captain, had made 3 of them, giving 1 to his son and the other 2 to his sons-in-law. One of these sons-in-law, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Tashiro, was the pilot of a 4-engined Kawanishi flying boat. He was, that April, based at Rabaul, flying bombing missions south to Tulagi. Martin Clemens was sure that the big Kawanishis, turning from their bombing runs at Tulagi, could not possibly spot the red tiles of his roof. Still, they gave him the shivers when they thundered low over Iola Bay on Guadalcanal. It was not so much that there seemed to be more of them every day, it was that they had absolute control of the air. Clemens didn't even bother to look up when he heard airplane motors. He knew that they would be Japanese, the Australian. Seaplanes, being much smaller than the Kawanishis, generally went and hid when they had wind of an air raid. Clemens felt very lonely and exposed. He was not heartened by the fact that the Australians had already informed him of the code signal that would signify their departure. It was steak and eggs, or, as the Aussies with their Cockney accents pronounced it, steik and eggs. It only served to remind Clemens that his food was running low. Out in the boondocks at Onslow Beach in North Carolina, the only eggs served were powdered, much to the disgust of Archer Vandegrift, who had never forgotten the reek of a Chinese powdered egg factory, and the only steak was a soggy counterfeit, which the cooks coyly called Swiss steak, and for which the troops had coined more colorful names, the only printable one of which was boiled boondocker, boondockers being the crepe-soled buckskin boots which Marines wore while tramping the boondocks or wild country. In early April, Vandegrift's division was beginning to coalesce. The boots had lost their frightened look and no longer said "sir" to corporals or saluted anyone, whose clothes seemed to fit. They had begun to swagger a bit. They were getting salty enough to speak of the floor or ground as the deck, to shove off, rather, than depart, to go ashore when they went into town, and to ask, whenever they were out rumor-mongering, the favorite pastime of all good armies since Agamemnon's, "Hey, what's the scuttlebutt?" Even old-timers such as Master Gunnery Sergeant Lou Diamond, a white-haired Marine Brahmin with a goatish goateed face and a bearish body, would concede grudgingly, "Them knotheads may not be so bad after all." And
Sergeant Manila John Basilone had ceased to snow his machine gun section
with lurid tales of life on Dewey Boulevard in Manila, and had granted that all of them had not been found under flat stones and might possibly have had an earlier and human existence elsewhere. These young Marines thought of themselves as the best fighters in the world, although the only fighting they had done had been with an occasional soldier or sailor unfortunate enough to come home on leave to New River or nearby Jacksonville, or with each other in the unpainted shacks, which followed them to the boondocks and sold them beer at 15 cents a bottle, and canned patriotic ballads such as "Goodbye Mama, I'm Off to Yokohama" at 5 cents per sentimental song. Sometimes moonshiners visited the pine woods where the 1st Marine Division lived in pup tents and slept on the ground. The moonshiners sold the Marines jugs of that potent corn whiskey, called White Lightning. Navy medical corpsmen and physicians who operated. The battalion aid stations, known as sick bays, always could tell when the moonshiners had been around. There were twice as many men on sick call, and the gentian violet had to be spread thin to cover all that bruised and battered flesh. Even so, the interfamilial brawling was a good sign. The men were developing. An esprit. Each squad thought itself the best in the platoon, each platoon the best in the company, and so on up through battalions and regiments. Riflemen regarded machine gunners as second-wave softies. The gunners looked down upon mortarmen as rear-echelon bastards, while the sight of clerks and technicians, to say nothing of artillerymen, about as common as a colonel in a pup tent, filled them all with stuttering rage. This is what is called the mystique of the Marine. The one man who might possibly have been the point in a battalion attack contemplates everyone else not so engaged with withering contempt. A man perhaps as much as 5 yards behind the lines is asked, "Where were you when the stuff hit the fan?" All of this, nevertheless, was mere training. It was all very light-hearted, and the real thing, the fiery crucible of combat, seemed far away. It seemed to General Vandegrift to be very far away, for he still considered his division many months short of combat readiness. None of the new arrivals and few of the battalion commanders had been through a full-dress ship-to-shore landing maneuver. They had to be content with a wooden mock-up of a ship, built beside Onslow Beach. Cargo nets were thrown over the side of this. Ungainly Trojan seahorse and the men clambered down them in full gear. Worse than this, far worse, were the mid-April levies on the division. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike, Edson, had arrived from Washington, with authority to comb Vandegrift's division for the best officers and men to fill. His 1st Raider Battalion. Vandegrift could only fume, silently. He knew that. President Roosevelt fancied having an American counterpart of the British. Commandos, although the Marine Corps Commandant, General Thomas Holcomb, shared Vandegrift's aversion to making an elite out of an elite. Unfortunately, FDR had become infected by Winston Churchill's penchant for military novelty, and because Roosevelt was actually very fond of the Marine Corps, he sometimes said, "We Marines," in conversations with Holcomb. He conferred this unwelcome enthusiasm on his favorite service. FDR's oldest son, James, was to be executive officer of the 2nd Raiders under the famous Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, after Edson departed from New River, leaving the 5th Marines. Slightly skeletonized, the worst blow fell. Vandegrift was ordered to beef up the 7th Regiment with his best men, weapons, and equipment, and to send it to the Samoan Islands. The general despaired. Into the 7th had gone many of his finest battalion commanders, tough and aggressive patrol officers from Haiti and Nicaragua, Marines such as Chesty Puller and Herman Henry Hannekin, who knew how to handle troops in jungle warfare. Now Vandegrift had to build. Again. For what? More raids? Was he to spend the war training troops for other men to command? On April 15th, 5 days after the 7th shipped out, Vandegrift's gloomy doubts were joyously dispelled. He was notified that he was to take the rest of his division to New Zealand. He was to train there preparatory to going into action as the landing force of the newly established South Pacific Amphibious Force. The South Pacific Area and Force had only just been established. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had already divided the Pacific Theater into the Southwest Pacific Area, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur from Australia, and the Pacific Ocean Area, commanded by Admiral Chester Nimitz from Hawaii. But because Nimitz's area was so vast, it was decided to subdivide it. The South Pacific Area was therefore created with its commander responsible to Nimitz. This commander was to be Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley. On April 17th, Gormley received this vague and hardly inspiring message from Admiral King. You have been selected to command the South Pacific Force and South Pacific area. You will have a large area under your command and a most difficult task. I do not have the tools to give you to carry out that task as it should. B. You will establish your headquarters in Auckland, New Zealand, with an advanced base at Tongatabu. In time, possibly this fall, we hope to start an offensive from the South Pacific. You will then probably find it necessary to shift the advanced base as the situation demands and move your headquarters to meet special situations. For a striking force, a single untrained and understrength Marine division. For support a shortage of ships and airplanes and hundreds of other invaluable items, such as bulldozers and runway matting, and yet Admiral Ernest King was already preparing the Pacific counteroffensive. He was adhering to his own admonition, do the best with what you have, and he was waiting for the Japanese to overreach. Unknown to King, he had already set in motion the operation that was to force the Japanese hand next day. The lookout on the Japanese picket boat sighted airplanes overhead. He could not make out their identity, but surely only 700 miles from Tokyo they could not be enemy. Nevertheless, he went below to wake the captain. "Planes above, sir!" he shouted. The skipper was not interested. He stayed in his bunk. The lookout went topside. An hour or so later he stiffened. He saw a pair of carriers on the horizon. Strange. He went below to wake the skipper again. "Two of our beautiful carriers ahead, sir." The captain came on deck and studied the ships through his glass. Color drained from his face. "They're beautiful," he said, "but they're not ours." He went below and shot himself in the head, for he had failed in his duty to protect the homeland and the Emperor. The carriers he had seen were Enterprise and Hornet, under command of Admiral Bull Halsey, and the planes were Jimmy Doolittle's Mitchell bombers, speeding for Tokyo and other Japanese cities. Once they had dropped their bombs, they would fly on to Chinese airfields. Meanwhile, Enterprise and a Hornet were streaking for home at top speed. A few hours later, the American ships tuned their radios to Tokyo. An English-speaking propagandist came on the air. He explained that of all the countries then at war, only Japan was free from attack. Admiral Yamamoto and the invincible combined fleet would utterly destroy anyone foolish enough to approach the shores of the sacred homeland. How fortunate the sons and daughters of Nippon enjoying today not only the festival of the cherry blossoms, but 2 fine baseball games as well. It was then that Bull Halsey heard the air raid siren. Japan was stunned. Not only Bull Halsey heard the sirens, but the haggling. Officers of Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet as well. Admiral Isoroku, Yamamoto burned with shame. He put on dress whites and called on Emperor Hirohito to apologize. And he came into Naval General Staff headquarters with his sword in his hand. The Midway operation must be executed. Obviously, the threat from the east was more urgent than the operation to isolate Australia. The Americans must be pushed back so far that the possibility of another such insult to the Emperor and the Navy would be ended forever. This time, staff agreed without reserve. Its pride had been wounded, and its chief, Admiral Osami Nagano, was also full of remorse. With all obstacles removed, the Midway invasion was set for early June. But then, with a characteristic inflexibility so baffling to Westerners, acting upon the national conviction that a course undertaken must be followed, Naval General Staff blandly continued its own operation against Australia. Port Moresby and Tulagi were to be invaded and captured in early May. Once, again, without being aware of it, Japan's naval general staff was drawing closer to the island named Guadalcanal.